Hello, everyone. It's a rather impromptu podcast in the wake of the much controversial Netflix series Adolescence. Everyone seems to be speaking about it, and now I'm speaking about it too, but I'm speaking with William Costello, a researcher, perhaps the only researcher actually working directly with Incels himself. So I thought, who better to have on? And perhaps, William, you can give us an intro yourself.
The Incel topic, I'm primarily an evolutionary psychology graduate student here at the University of Texas at Austin. But my main line of research that I've published on so far has been the topic of incels, or involuntary celibates, who are, for any listener or viewer who doesn't know, they're a group of men who form a strong sense of identity around their perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships. They hang out in online forums, often in groups, and their rhetoric can delve into quite misogynistic terrain. The incel identity comes with a whole kind of set of beliefs that are bought into to varying degrees by different members, one of which is the idea of the black pill, which describes, for incels, accepting the particularly bleak truth that for them, they believe that they never stood a chance in forming romantic relationships and that they were never able to do it, and they should accept that it's over. And in their own kind of language, they say that they should lay down and rot. So it's a very, very nihilistic, very bleak kind of group and identity. And the incel ideology makes the mainstream news basically on the back of a handful of violent attacks that claimed to have been done in the name of incel ideology. The media gets into a frenzy about this often. There's been a few very high-profile cases of that. But from our research and from looking at the actual statistics, the threat of violence to others is largely overblown. And what we find in the research is that incels are actually far more likely to be a danger to themselves if you consider the extremely high rates of suicidality and really low mental health across the board. So basically, this topic has, in the last couple of weeks, I've been inundated with requests for interviews and media and comments based on the back of this really popular Netflix TV show called Adolescence that pretty much centers, it mainstreams an incel storyline with some degree of sophistication for the first time. Usually when the incel topic gets treatment in a documentary or in a TV show, it's very, very trivialized, it's very lampooned or not done with any degree of sophistication. Now this one seems a little bit different, and it gets a lot of things right, it gets a lot of things wrong, but at least it's dealing with the topic with some degree of more thoughtfulness, I would say. But it really has made quite the splash. I think it's Netflix's most popular show for the last couple of weeks in a number of different countries. It's really polished kind of production, really well acted, well written. And there's even talk, it's reached the high levels now where the creators of the show kind of are crying out for their show to be shown in schools to help teachers and adults address this problem, and even to be shown in Parliament. To what end, I'm not quite sure, but it kind of, that gives you a bit of an indication of the splash that this TV show is making. So I thought, who better to talk about what the show gets right and wrong about male psychology, specifically incel psychology, the rising misogyny, all the different issues that young boys are facing, than with yourself, George, because I really admire your channel and what it tries to do in the world.
Well, thank you, William. I feel like I've learned more about incels just in that 2-minute spiel than I did in all 4 episodes of Adolescence, which I've now watched twice. You mentioned, and we'll come back to it, but you mentioned Westminster wanting to watch it. I'm not sure if that's a serious suggestion by them. I've seen that clip too, but Westminster already know a lot about incels as a result of commissioning research. And in fact, they commissioned your research. So their knowledge is based on your findings. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit perplexing from our point of view as researchers to see a piece of art, a really powerful piece of art in the TV show Adolescence, being kind of heralded as the thing that should be shown and discussed in Parliament. I'm a big fan of art and powerful art, but it should spark a conversation. But in Parliament, I think what should be discussed is the actual research not a fictional portrayal, no matter how powerful that might be. I would have no problem with perhaps showing the TV show, as long as it was also just the topic was also discussed with real research. The creators of the program may not know, but yeah, like you said, the UK government commissioned my colleagues and I to conduct the largest incel research in the world, and we presented those findings to the Women's and Equalities Committee in Parliament in the last summer, and that is all available on YouTube. You can watch the whole proceedings where our findings are kind of discussed and interrogated. It was a really, really positive experience. We felt, listened to, that the politicians involved came away with a different perspective. So, I've been kind of online. I've been spamming any high-profile posting of the TV show with a link to our findings being discussed with the Women's and Equalities Committee. But I don't want to go overboard on that. But yeah, I'm happy that the show is starting a conversation. I think that's important. I'm happy that it's giving the topic a bit more sophisticated treatment than usual, than some documentaries or films. But if it is to be discussed in Parliament, I think it's important that it's also discussed in light of the real research that's being done.
It's too early to tell whether it will be a net positive or net negative to the conversation. I mean, I guess I went through a similar thing when the Johnny Depp trial came sort of public attention. I was like, could this be the time when we finally talk about male victims of female perpetrated abuse? And ultimately, no, it wasn't. It became like a circus act, and it was an opportunity wasted. Baby Reindeer, slightly different. I think that did have some important impacts on the same sort of thing, particularly on stalking. But for this, we don't quite know. But in headlines, I'd love for you to give like 2 sets of reviews out of 5. So 5-star, one for it as a piece of filmmaking, and another piece for its intellectual honesty within the realm of incel research. So let's start with it as a piece of filmmaking. What would you give it out of 5?
As a piece of art and filmmaking, in terms of the acting and the emotional drama, I would say 4.5 towards 5.
Yeah.
A lot has been made about, I don't want to get too artsy about this. I'm not an expert. This is just my opinion. But a lot has been made about the pioneering of this one-shot take, which I think is very powerful. And the film 1917 did something similar in a war scenario, in a war movie. But I just don't know how much this topic needed that.
Yeah. No, I agree. So we use the term style over substance. I think is fair. I mean, I would give it 5 stars. It's beautiful. And I think 1917, I don't think it only looked like it's a single take. There are ways in which filmmaking, you can stitch shots together. I've checked out Adolescence, and it was actually one take. It is actually legitimate. And in Birdman, the same, Alfred Hitchcock wrote similar. It's not the first time it's been done, but most of those times they'll have like a cyclist go in front of shot and then they'll cut. But with this, it actually really was one take, which is incredible. But I agree. Well, what is that adding intellectually? And I guess that brings me to the second review. What do you think about it as a researcher?
Sure. So I can maybe go through the good and the bad and kind of break it up like that.
Give us the 5-star review first.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I want to be
so crude,
nailed to the mast on that one. I'll just rather go through the specifics than give it a headline star. What I thought it did very well was it shone a light on, first of all, the confusion of many adults involved around this topic. There's a lot of concern and worry. Phones, internet, porn, online misogyny. There's a lot of kind of spinning plates for adults to worry about that are very, very novel for them. So I thought it depicted the confusion of the teachers, the parents, and the one police officer very well. So if that was intentional, then it captured that very well. I also thought that it shone a light on the ineptitude or the struggles of the school system. So my previous career, I was a careers advisor. So I've been in schools up and down the UK, and I've seen how kids act, the tensions between them and teachers, and how overstretched they are. I thought it really depicted that very well, and it's particularly the lack of good male role model. So the male teachers are kind of depicted. You have Mr. Malik, who comes into the classroom late with his shirt untucked and kind of bumbling, burnt out. He says to the cop, "What the hell do you expect me to do with these kids? What can we do?" And I think with the high rate of burnout among teachers, I believe it's impossible to keep teachers more than 5 years now. It's a real recruitment problem for schools. I think that it depicted that very well. It also tried to perhaps shine a light on, I don't know if the message was, there was a lot of angry male teachers who were trying to kind of discipline the students or control them using anger, which maybe a lot of teachers might recognize. I don't know if the message there was implicit or subtle that this was feeding into the anger of young boys. But I also did think that the show captured something I recognized in schools a lot, which is that young boys and the troublesome young boys in schools will respond more with less aggression and less abrasiveness to a male teacher than a female teacher. So perhaps the headline message of that, if I was to put a positive spin on it, is for the need for really good male role model teachers to intervene there, because I do think that young boys are less aggressive to male teachers. That was my experience in school. That was my experience as a professional going into schools. So I think the show captured that quite well. Now, you can say that that's an example of misogyny, but I don't think so. I think it's just an example of an acknowledgement of sex differences.
But which way does that go? Because I've also read research that male teachers are less likely to problematize a boy's behavior than female teachers. So if a male teacher is able to understand what boys' misbehavior is, would you not expect that to be reciprocal? So a boy is also a bit more charitable, perhaps.
Yeah, and perhaps just the display of anger is a bit more tempered, first of all, and second of all, processed by the male teacher as less problematic. It's kind of understood. Whereas a female teacher, there's massive sex differences in our psychologies. So a female teacher is naturally going to process aggression as more problematic. It is perhaps scarier for her than a male teacher. So wherever those kind of differences come from, it's important to get positive male role models who have those skills, who can a range of different skills that can be used and are important in schools. The other thing that I thought was very accurate was they depicted the volatility and antagonism of an angry young teen towards any authority figure. So this is where I'm talking about is the episode 3, where Jamie has his meeting with the psychiatrist. They oscillate between extreme antagonism. She's trying to cultivate rapport with him, which is very recognizable as a professional dealing with young people. And he oscillates between extreme anger towards her, trying to charm her with being cooperative, trying to highlight any areas where he has more control, and where he perceives the rules as being in his favor. So he's very annoyed and disturbed when she begins to ask him questions that he thinks she's not allowed to ask. So you can almost recognize that some kids, when they're in school and they get in trouble, they almost know what the teachers can and can't do, and they kind of manipulate that to their favor. But in that scene, a lot of people are commenting on it that it reveals what a sociopath or psychopath Jamie is, that he was able to do this and try to be manipulative and angry. And I didn't think that at all. I just recognized a normal enough young teenage boy, that I think a lot of teachers might recognize that in a lot of teenage boys there is a lot of confused anger, anger at yourself almost as well. If the child does get angry, if you kind of almost beat yourself up about it and double down on the anger. I thought it was very accurate portrayal of young male rage. But was there anything there that I think the kid wouldn't have had if he didn't watch Andrew Tate, or if he didn't get captured by incel ideology? I don't know. Maybe there was a little bit of resentment towards her for being pretty. He kind of suggests that she might have life on easy mode, as the incels would say, for being a pretty woman. He had perhaps a fixation on being liked, a fixation on he even comments that he perceives himself as ugly, which is accurate of the incel mindset, and that's something the show didn't go into too much, but it did give little hints at. I also saw that scene depicted what I perceive as the show was trying to depict, that he feels this pressure to present himself as sexually successful, or the type of boy that would become sexually successful. And perhaps that's getting at that modern pressure that is cultivated by the online manosphere ideologies, this kind of pressure to present yourself as sexually successful. He even makes up some lies about how sexually successful he was.
She was quite easily rattled by Jamie. Of course, we're watching a TV show, and a clinical psychologist, that's very much matter of fact and blank face. That's not great TV. So there's obviously a lot of creative license in there. But do you think she was quite easily rattled by Jamie?
Yeah, perhaps that bit was a little bit unrealistic. So my own girlfriend is a clinical psychology student and also a supply teacher in schools. And she kind of was exacerbated by this. She thought, wow, I encounter worse than this on a typical Tuesday in schools. And, you know, he's just being a normal teenage adversarial kind of young boy, a very antagonistic. And I did think the scene was very powerful. Terrific actor, Doherty. She was great in The Crown as well. But they did have this great chemistry on screen of this trying to cultivate rapport, trying to charm one another. And I think as professionals working with an antagonizing young boy, you can recognize that. But on a realistic portrayal point of view, which I guess isn't great for TV, but I would hope that a prison psychiatrist is a lot less easily rattled than that. And I thought it was a really brave decision and bold decision from the showmakers to have the storyline even broach the idea that the child who is the killer, the villain in the story, could have been triggered by his victim's bullying of him about being an incel. It also highlighted the unique role of social media, that this can be done subtly away from the prying eyes of the adults, but also it can accumulate a consensus of your peers. So it was commented that her comments about calling him an incel received so many likes. So there's this perception and a lot of male violence, and it's usually male on male violence, particularly young men in knife crime. Overwhelming victims of knife crime are men at the hands of other men. It's very rare, and perhaps it's very rare that a boy stabs a girl, and perhaps this is why the incidents that Stephen Graham talks about for inspiring the show stood out to him so much, because it's really quite rare, male on female violence in that way. But what triggered it resonated, because young men are very concerned with status. So to have a public slighting of your masculinity, of your sexuality, of your sexual acumen, your ability to be sexually successful in front of everyone, to see it accumulate likes, that would push a button for sure. And what I thought was good about the show is it wasn't an accurate depiction of the prototypical knife crime, which I would wager is actually more motivated causally by drill music and gang violence than Manosphere content. But it did kind of depict a plausible interpretation that a young man captured by this ideology, fixated on his perception of being sexually successful, feeling humiliated by who he perceives as a more sexually powerful young woman, seeing that all his peers have acknowledged that. He's somehow found in his hands a knife that his friend had given him. All of this is like male posturing. And he hunts her down with the intention of, I presume, not killing her, but perhaps just displaying his anger or rectifying his humiliation. And it ultimately gets out of hand. It wasn't so much like the cold-blooded killing that perhaps other shows would depict. So I thought that was quite good.
I know I've read research I often cite that came from Cambridge, University of Cambridge, about bullying and how boys that are relentlessly bullied in school, 97% of them go on to have violent fantasies, because violent fantasies are basically a coping mechanism for him to deal with more bullying. So as a way of getting ready for more violence to come, you fantasize about violence, and a lot of men don't grow out of that.
To tie that back into the incel research, we explicitly find incels are much, much more likely to report feeling bullied, having experienced bullying in childhood. Now, you have to perhaps take some of that with a pinch of salt. It's just self-report. There's no way to verify that this occurred, but it is much, much higher. And I recognize incels do have a high level also of rejection sensitivity and a victimhood mindset, but it is plausible if you consider the high rates of autism and the perhaps low physical attractiveness of incels, that it is plausible that they have experienced bullying. There is a high degree of lookism in society. There's a lot of research on that. That's not fake. That's real.
Mm.
Unattractive people are bullied at high rates, and people with young men with autism certainly as well. So it is plausible that they. I mean, even now you can see that incels get bullied. It's used as a term of insult. It functions as an insult to just denigrate any man you don't like. Even Andrew Tate gets called an incel, which is kind of paradoxical, because I thought the problem was he was having problematic type of sex, but he's certainly not incel, but maybe buys into some incel rhetoric. But yeah, it certainly is used as an insult. There's even forums. We wrote in our recent paper about how incels actually underperceive the sympathy that society has for them, and they overperceive the hostility. But I thought it was important in our paper, we had to write a couple of paragraphs showing that there is real hostility towards incels. They are bullied quite a lot. They're the only group, really, that you can go online and say whatever you want about them, and you'll be fine. Everyone will almost applaud you, actually.
Yeah.
Yes, I recognize that there's a lot of misogynistic rhetoric among the incel forums, but there's a lot of bullying towards incels too. Just to put one final point on that, there's even forums called Incel Tears, as a Reddit forum, and the idea there is it's a forum for people to go and laugh about incels. And the bullying in those forums got so bad that they had to instantiate a rule in the forum to say, please, people, can you stop encouraging incels to commit suicide? And if you consider the high levels of suicidality that we find in our research, we found that 30% of our sample of incels, which is the largest sample of incels in the world, said that they thought about suicide every day for the last 2 weeks. So that's using the PHQ-9 clinical measure used by the NHS to measure depression. The 9th item is the suicidality item, and incels score extraordinarily high. So to put that into context, 5% of people in the UK say that they have a suicidal thought within the last year. So this is incels, 30% of them having suicidal thoughts every day over the last 2 weeks. So extraordinarily high levels of suicidality.
Well, careful, William. It sounds like you're presenting incels as victims in their own right, and that's not going to go down well. I'm very interested in what you talk about. The girl in Adolescence obviously does it. She calls Jamie an incel in those Instagram comments, and I'd love to hear more about how that is almost self-fulfilling. By calling him an incel, you're actually pushing him further into incel culture. I often get called an incel. I dread to think how often you get called an incel, and of course we're not. So I've always found it disappointing how often it's used as a generic slur for any man, particularly on the right, with whom you disagree. And it's strange how the people use it as a slur. It's almost like you're basically incentivizing men to go and have sex. Like you're perpetuating the exact same value system as slut shaming, but often in reverse. Can you talk a little bit more about how calling men an incel so needlessly and incorrectly is actually not helping anyone, making the situation worse?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but it's hard to combat that because there is currency in being the type of man who is sexually selected. It's very linked to status. Sex and status are very intricately linked for men and for women. So there's a reason it's intuitive that it functions as an insult. But you're right that levying it as an insult absolutely reinforces the incel worldview that the main currency is the ability to attract women. Calling men incels like that, it kind of reinforces their worldview that women are only interested in the most attractive men, which is incorrect. It absolutely kind of doubles down and reinforces the mindset. So if you are a young man who has these concerns, if you receive insults like that, incels are high on what we call self-verification. So they're already primed to seek out information that proves their worldview correct. So if you give them that, the world is full of information that prove incels right about themselves. They engage in what I call performative antagonism. They antagonize people intentionally online in order to prove themselves right that they're abused. And it's this kind of back and forth that constantly goes on. And ultimately, eventually, we have to break the wheel, or break this cycle. You have to prove incels wrong about what society thinks about them. That's why I was excited about our recent paper that showed society typically has a lot more sympathy for them than incels think. But here's the caveat. It wasn't true for one particular group, feminist women. They, perhaps
Wow.
understandably, had way more animosity towards incels in our study than any other group.
Well, colour me shocked on that one. I mean, that's not surprising whatsoever, but also kind of saddening that it's been sort of found in the research. I mean, I love that episode with the clinical psychologist, Jamie. Another classic scene was the very first scene where like a bunch of counter-terrorist police officers with guns kick down the door, throw the family on the ground, drag them out of bed and sling them in the back of a car. But is that the correct approach to the incel crisis? Because I've always learned from your research that the response to the incel crisis isn't one of counter-terrorism, but it's one of mental health interventions. Amazing TV, don't get me wrong, but is that the correct approach to dealing with incels?
So incels is often talked about as the new terrorist threat or a new terrorist group. And my position and some other terrorism studies experts, that's not my background, but we have done some research on the counter-extremism on behalf of the Counter-Extremism Commission with an extremism expert, by the way, on our team. And it's their position that it is more accurately described as a mental health problem. Terrorism relates to political violence for a group who have an ideology and they have a political end goal in mind and an agreed upon action by which its members needs to bring that future goal to reality. So think about ISIS. They want an Islamic State. They agree that violence is necessary to get there. There is no such thing with incel ideology. It is an ideology in so much as it's a mindset that it encourages individuals to buy into. And the main goal, if you could describe one, is that they are trying to get other men to give up on trying in romantic relationships. So there's no common thread of that motivates political violence. So in my opinion and in other terrorism experts' opinions, it shouldn't be classified as a terrorism problem. There is the potentiality for lone wolf actors to do like mass shootings or school shootings. That's more similar to the profile, and incels would be at high risk of that, even though even in those cases the violence is overblown compared to the mental health problems. But we even found in our study, one thing that we tried to do was predict among incels what were the factors that best predicted this tendency towards a whole host of problematic attitudes and behaviors, but including incel violence. And we created 3 predictive factors. So one was a mental health composite, one was a networking composite, so how much they actually interacted with other incels, and one was an ideology factor, so how much they actually bought into the specific incel beliefs. And what we found was that, yes, all 3 factors predicted the harmful attitudes and beliefs, including hostile sexism, violent agreement, endorsement of violence. So all 3 factors predicted them independently, but mental health and ideology did so at twice the predictive power of the networking. So in terms of intervention, this idea of get rid of the phones, stop them talking to each other, I don't think that's a realistic issue, but it's also a less effective one, even if you did accomplish it. Another interesting factor was that mental health and ideology had a bidirectional effect, so they exacerbated each other. And the way I would kind of describe that as, when you're in really poor mental health, you go for the black and white solution, the black and white explanation of anything that's complex. And there is nothing more complex than the dating market for a young man to try and understand. So if you're in really poor mental health, you will look, and specifically if you're in poor mental health and you are an autistic young man, you will absolutely look for the most black and white description of what you're going through. And the incel ideology offers you that. So it's no wonder that the poor mental health feeds into the ideology and vice versa. But yeah, there's other terrorism studies experts that think we're already stretched in terms of counterterrorism initiatives. If you add the massive range of what's perceived as misogyny among young boys to that workload, that's going to really create problems. And, if I was ISIS at the moment, I would be thinking, fantastic, the UK counterterrorism, we're going to pump loads more money into incel problem rather than worrying about it.
What you're saying is that instead of incels being a sort of a collective group with a shared political end, they're just basically a very disparate group of young men who are extremely mentally unwell, who absolutely have, some of them have absolutely horrendous, violent ambitions, but they're not an organized terrorist group, and therefore they're not actually a terrorist threat.
Yes, and also just from a logistics point of view, these young men, they don't even know who they are in real life. I mean, in the TV show Adolescence, it depicted a group of young boys who kind of collectively bought into this ideology a little bit. But as far as we know from the research, that's very rare. Most incels don't meet offline. There's no incel conferences where they all meet together. So organizing them into a collective terrorist group would be a logistical nightmare. And even the online radicalization, my colleague would tell you, is a little bit overblown in terms of how much of a problem it is. Simon Cotty wrote a paper on this, and he talks about how real-world radicalization requires the real-world input. So it happens in mosques, you need the charismatic leader, all of these things. An incel ideology and the incel group is lacking in that completely. If they have any overarching goal as a group, it's to get other young men to give up on romantic relationships.
Well, one of the things I've also learned from your research is that the archetype of an incel is very different to what we expect. What we expect is sort of Jamie, like a young white boy. But if you were to recast that role, who would you cast to be most representative of an incel in real life from your experience?
Yeah, and so the profile of the young man who gets captured by incel ideology didn't quite fit the research, but it's perhaps understandable that Stephen Graham, as an artist, decides to depict kind of what he knows. He knows working class white families. Perhaps that's a lot easier for him to portray. But in any case, how much does Jamie fit the incel research? So first of all, he's a little bit younger. As the cop in the TV show says, every 13-year-old is an incel to some degree. But I think what the show was trying to get at with that is that this pressure to achieve sexual success hits young men younger and younger in schools, and that was probably a creative decision they made. That was fine. Jamie is white. Now, most knife crime is not 13-year-old white boys. I would say it's largely gang violence inspired by drill music, so that's something also. But whether the show was tackling knife violence in and of itself with the main goal, or whether it was trying to tap into something specific about how Manosphere ideology might inspire violence, it's perhaps a less frequent problem, but they're depicting how that might manifest, and I think they did so in a fairly plausible way. But a couple of the main findings that really strongly come through in our research that weren't depicted, incels in our research are disproportionately an ethnic minority. So 42% in our recent research, which is an exclusively US and UK sample of incels, 42% were a person of color. So that is different to how the media typically portrays the incel problem as being angry, far-right kind of politics-motivated young men. There's a lot of incels of color. And it's interesting, when I give talks at universities, a lot of progressive academics are not very sympathetic about the problem, but then when they hear about the ethnic minority representation, it cultivates a bit more sympathy. So,
well, maybe that's why they cast him as a white boy then, so he's a better villain than a black boy. Perhaps that explains.
Yeah, that it was less sympathetic to the group, the intelligentsia. The other thing they didn't represent, and perhaps it would be very bold of them to do so, is the massive overrepresentation of autism among incels. So to put it into context, previous research found that 18% of incels self-reported a diagnosis of autism. In our recent research, we use something called the AQ10 scale to measure how many are likely to have autism. And we found that by that scale, 30% of incels likely have autism. Now, I just want to be very clear, that scale is not to diagnose, but by that scale, if you score 6 out of 10 or above on that scale, the suggestion is, the advice is to send that person for a clinical referral. And 80% of people who go on to the clinical referral, having scored 6 out of 10 or above on this scale, go on to receive autism. So that's we used a conservative estimate on our participants, and it still came out at 30%. Now, that's extraordinarily high when you consider that the prevalence of autism among young men in America is 1%. So it's a 30-fold increase. So it's a massive overrepresentation, and perhaps something people don't know enough about the incel problem. We were talking in the Parliament about this, and that was one of the main areas of focus. And there's a lot of reasons. I'm writing a paper right now, actually, on the specific why incel ideology, why young men with autism might be particularly vulnerable to the incel ideology, the black and white explanation of your romantic difficulties, all things like that, a special niche interest topic, very online, doesn't require a lot of in-person interaction. There's a lot of reasons why they're very vulnerable. And there's some troubling evidence that when captured by the ideology of any extremist ideology, they may be particularly prone to extremist violence, like mass shootings and things like that. So that's one area that the show didn't get into at all, but perhaps it's hard to expect them to do so. It's already going to be a controversial show. If you add in autism into the mix, that's a double whammy for them, probably. And the other thing is just the mental health. It just didn't really depict the poor levels of mental health in as extreme a way as the research shows. So yes, it depicted a little bit of low self-esteem or kind of anxiety about being ugly, anxiety about being... there were also subtle hints that the young boys were disturbed that looks matter to women. Jamie himself had a fixation on being liked and trying to prove he was sexually successful, but there was no real... They did indicate that he spent a lot of time in his room, didn't engage in any hobbies, and spent a lot of time online. That's accurate for the incel profile, but the extreme levels of poor mental health didn't really get into that fully.
It's the thing is, every time we talk about incels, it sort of becomes worse television, and I become a lot more compassionate towards them. You're talking about very lonely young men, often people of colour, often massively overwhelmingly represented of autism, extraordinarily low, poor mental health, and depression, anxiety, very apprehensive around mental health service. I'm like, this sounds like someone that needs help, not someone that needs to be dragged out of bed and shouted at. My big concern about this is that we're going to create a public perspective of incels that is centered around that sort of thinking. I often get mothers tapping me on the shoulder, very worried about their boys, and they'll say, well, I caught him watching Andrew Tate, saying, well, I gave him an hour-long lecture about it. And I'm very worried about this finger wagging and this very extreme vilification that I don't think is accurate and may actually make it worse, because you're only going to push them further away.
Yeah,
that's my main concern.
It's always confusing to me when people are perplexed by why Andrew Tate is popular among many young men, and how popular he is among young men remains to be seen. There's a lot of panic about it, but there's no research I'm aware of that's actually measured how popular he is. But nonetheless, he is influential, and a lot of teachers report his rhetoric is influential in schools. But the idea that a kind of a celebrity influencer who promises to tell you how to get rich, powerful, and get loads of women and loads of fast cars, the idea that it's a mystery of why that would be appealing to young boys who are told in schools how toxic they are, how terrible they are for decades now, they're probably a bit bored of that. So that would be appealing to them. Also, specifically on the idea of how to get women, there's, as far as I know, there's a lot of sexual education initiatives in schools, talking about consent, talking about health, which is great. We've made great progress on that. But as far as I know, there's nothing that actually helps young people learn about what makes for an attractive partner to the other sex or to your preferred sex. Nothing to show about how you actually cultivate what we call mate value. Maybe you wouldn't want to use that term in these school interventions or whatever, but I think you should have something to offer, because the mating market, as we call it, is a really fierce contest that you enter when you become a teenager, and there is no preparation for it. You're just thrown in to an extreme baptism of fire, and it becomes the most important thing in the world to you. So everything else is second to this goal, and you have no guidance on it. You just have to figure it out on your own. And the kind of modern young man doesn't have the tools to do that. And they're clinging to these pickup artists or online people like Andrew Tate, who are at least offering them something. And it's terrible tactics that they teach them, the pickup artist. It prioritizes short-term mating success rather than cultivating a long-term flourishing relationship. It causes animosity between men and women. But if that's the only tool that's available that speaks to your goal, then you're going to cling to it. And, so I think we need to do better with filling that vacuum, because otherwise Andrew Tate does fill it, and it makes sense. The idea of self-development, that seems so intuitive to me and so motivating for young men, but is never spoke about in schools. I worked in schools up and down the country, and perhaps it would be, maybe I'm being too blasé and this is perhaps inappropriate in schools. I don't think so. You have problems with getting young boys to come to school, right? I think if they were taught, achieving this status in school, getting high grades, showing your intelligence, all of that will help you get a long-term partner in the future. I think you'd have packed seats in this classroom. And it could be, at first, it could be pretty benign things like the boys and the girls learn about what makes for an effective dating app profile. That's pretty, not that scary for kids to do. They're learning about sex. I'm sure they can learn about the precursors to sex and all the courting that needs to go into it. So it feels like there's all this pressure for young men and young women to form relationships, less guidance, and a more complicated world in which to do it. And they don't have the tools. So I think that's a really important thing we intervene on.
I totally agree. I mean, you're right, it's a controversial topic, but that's really besides the point. Like these lessons are going to be taught to boys, especially. The only decision we have is that, are we going to teach boys ourselves, or are we going to allow boys to be taught in their bedrooms over TikTok by Andrew Tate and similar figures? The line I so often see between Andrew Tate and incels, even in the show, it was almost like it was actually through the next breath. I think the line was like, oh, he's an incel, and then, oh, that Andrew Tate shit. There's obviously an overlap there. There's the misogyny, there's the anti-feminism part of it. But incels and Andrew Tate are not natural bedfellows. And in fact, incels often hate people like Andrew Tate. They see them as chads. So a lot of people don't know what Chad is or Stacey is, but there's a lot of disdain between incels and Andrew Tate. Can you just dispel some of those myths?
Yeah, absolutely. Really good point. And I think, being charitable to the show, I think that was intentional to try and show the confusion of the adults in the room about this topic, that it just all bundled in together. And even the psychiatrist, you got the feeling she was almost trying to draw straight lines from different features, such as his pornography use, his father's influence, the internet addiction, his views on women. It was trying to kind of figure it out and stumble through it. But that scene in particular, the fact that Andrew Tate is just bundled in with the incel issue when there's such a massive amount of daylight between those. So Andrew Tate antagonizes incels online regularly. He has backs and forths where he offers to take incels out and show them how they needn't be an incel anymore. So incels buy into the black pill, which for them describes accepting the truth that they never stood a chance and they should stop trying. That's very specifically different to the red pill kind of vibe that Andrew Tate offers, which suggests, here's how you manipulate women. Here's how you get them to do your bidding, basically, and how you manipulate them and aggress on them. That's very, very different. So there's a huge space in this manosphere space that needs to be, teachers need to understand the different facets of it. But I think that was stylistic from the show to show that just even the cop dismissively says, oh yeah, it's that Andrew Tate shite, when really there's a huge amount of difference between incels and Andrew Tate and red pill followers.
I think, you've nailed it there. I still don't know the intentions of the show. In the final episode, the mum says something like, Jamie just went upstairs and closed the door and we had no idea what was going on. And there's two different shows here. There's either the one on the outside of that door where we don't know what's going on and we're just trying our best and we're throwing around catchphrases. We're talking about Andrew Tate and incels. We're talking about violence. We don't actually know what we're talking about. And then there's the opposite show that's on the inside of that bedroom where we get to watch Jamie sort of go down this pipeline everyone keeps talking about. That's the show I would have liked to have seen. And that was wholly missing. I didn't see any of that indoctrination, the bullying. It was all retrospectively told. And as a result, a lot of these concepts seem sort of crowbarred in, thrown in without any sort of awareness or understanding. And it's only from talking to you that maybe that was the intention, to show it's not the writers that are naive. They're writing the story from the outside about closed door, about the world that is naive, in a way that we just throw around catchphrases, and we don't understand the incel crisis. I mean, you certainly do, but the people in the show don't. And I've always thought that was just poor writing on the script writer's behalf, but perhaps it's, don't know, like a intelligent way to basically show we don't know what we're talking about, and we desperately need to do more to understand what is happening on the inside about closed door, where Jamie spent night after night after night doing God knows what. So I would love, could you take us through what is this incel pipeline? What is actually happening to boys like Jamie? Like, what does that journey look like?
Well, first of all, it very rarely transitions all the way through to violence towards other people. And when it does, it has, I don't think there's ever been a specific case of an incel who targeted one specific woman. They mainly just have mass violence towards mostly random people. That's not to say it couldn't happen, but you're right about this idea of it being a pipeline. There is actual data to show that there's a pipeline from people who use pickup artist forums all the way through to incel forums. Now, the way that works is, imagine you're a young man and you're really stressed about figuring out how to get a girlfriend, and you know all this pressure of people will call you an incel if you don't, and it's more confusing than ever. It seemed easier in your father's time. The school is saying nothing about it. And then you find this group of men who have a lot of success themselves, and you follow their crude tactics. And imagine if you're autistic young man and you follow their crude tactics and they don't really work, then you reach the black and white conclusion that you're incel, and you go towards the black pill, and you have this doomerism, this nihilism that it's there's no point in you trying, and that cultivates a lot of misogyny. If you feel completely excluded from romantic relationships, if you are captured by an ideology that suggests most women are only interested in a narrow minority of men, he draws a straight line. He says one natural conclusion to that, or result of that, is to come to the conclusion that you need to rectify this situation and assert your dominance and rectify that humiliation. But it's a good point that the writer made in his interview, that most boys who are exposed to this content never take it to a natural conclusion from it. One thing I did find very interesting that the show kind of hinted at is a theory that I'm working on about the function of misogyny. So we're seeing a lot of evidence showing that misogyny is most concentrated among young men who perceive themselves as low mate value, so perceive themselves as less attractive to the opposite sex. A lot of evidence coming in from different directions on this. Even unwanted celibacy, not just to do with incel identity, that predicts misogyny in a strong way. And the way I describe this as the function of what that might be trying to do is to help lower women's standards so you feel like you have a chance. So within relationships, we have evidence of this, where low mate value men inflict a cost-inflicting mate retention strategy on their partner. So you have two mate retention strategies. You can choose the benefit provisioning one, which you make it so good for your partner to be with you that she never wants to leave. And thankfully, most people pursue this strategy. But if you don't have much benefit to provision, you choose the cost infliction one. And you hear things like partners who say to each other, "Oh, who would have you except me?" And they try and lower their partner's self-esteem, which is kind of counterintuitive, and lower their partner's sense of their own mate value. Now, my opinion is that incel rhetoric and the misogynistic rhetoric online is a type of coordinated condemnation to this effect. So it's important that it's coordinated among many men. And it's very telling that incel groups and misogynistic male groups like this, they galvanize together primarily. Yes, they're misogynistic towards women and hostile, but they're mainly trying to convince other men to buy into this belief system too. Because if you're a misogynist and you're trying to lower women's self-esteem so that you stand a chance, if you're the only one doing that, then you are just easily dismissed as just one asshole. But if you convince your whole social milieu to do this, which is what Jamie tried to capitalize on in the show. So Jamie describes making a move on Katie, the eventual victim, when he described her as she might have perceived herself as being weak, specifically in response to when other boys had shared revenge porn about her or had called her flat-chested. So it was very specific that he thought other boys, in my coordinated condemnation, have lowered her mate sense of self-perceived mate value or her self-esteem. She may be feeling weak, as he describes it. That was his time to try and make a move, and he still didn't get success, still called an incel, so it really enraged him. But I thought that was an interesting, perhaps an inadvertent stumble into my pet theory that I'm kind of developing at the moment. But that it really kind of showed it in action, which was interesting from my point of view. But I may be just a nerd on that front.
That totally flew under the radar for me. I didn't notice. I mean, I know the bit you're talking about where Katie had her nudes leaked and she was obviously destroyed, and he tried to come in there to try and capitalize upon it. And if you're saying that's one of the functions of misogyny, to lower someone's value, that does make a lot of sense.
Typically, if you think about the exact type of rhetoric that these misogynistic groups use, so first of all, they denigrate women's choices. So they denigrate that women choose Chad for his looks, but that he ends up abusing them. They really try and amplify that most violence towards women is from their partners, which is true. That is true. You're much more likely to be harmed by your partner as a woman than a sexless incel. So incels really bang the drum on this point. So it's basically trying to say women should have different choices. They shouldn't prioritize looks as much. But you can see what incels are trying to do with this rhetoric. It really almost seems functionally designed to try and lower women's sense of their own mate value and lower their standards so they have a chance.
It makes me think of two other things. Seeing misogyny in that view, it reminds me of some research I read where they looked at misogynistic tweets on Twitter at the time, and they found that 60% of misogynistic tweets came from women. So in that way, that makes sense too, because it's also women trying to bring down the value of other women for their own benefit. And it also reminds me of what we talked about earlier about people like you and I getting called incel, where it feels like it's the opposite, where people are attacking our status in absurd ways. I get called, you must live in your parents' basement, you must be unemployed or a loser or a virgin or an incel. And these are all things that are not true. And they're obviously attacks on my status.
The mating market is very competitive, it's hierarchical, it's not very egalitarian in the way mating success is distributed. The amount of women that deny that looks have anything to do with their mating choices. I mean, it certainly is, based on the research, more important to men than women, but the fact that some women say looks is not important at all is very disingenuous. Looks aren't nothing. There's a threshold that one has to cross in terms of physical attractiveness to attract someone, that's for sure.
And the whole red pill ideology in this TV show seemed to just be contained to a very quick scene between the police officer and his son, and he talks about the red pill and the blue pill and the whatever else pill. You talked about black pill already, but there's a variety of pills of every single colour you can imagine. And I feel like you're, in many ways, a pharmacist. So can you tell me, what are these pills? Just talk us through them.
Yeah, and that the fact that it was all bundled into just one scene, where this kind of the confusion of the cop was explained to him in one short scene from his son, and it wasn't really fully explained. It was just kind of made clear to him how much he didn't know. Now, that being intentional from the show, I thought was maybe good. Given how sophisticated they were in other areas, would I like to see them have 6 more episodes to properly unpack all of the ideology and how it takes hold? I would have liked to see that. So, okay, as the pharmacist on the pills, it can all be basically understood, like the show says, based on the movie The Matrix. So, red pill people describe taking the red pill as waking up to women's true nature and the real nature of the mating market and what you might need to do to manipulate them in that mating market. There's where you think of your Andrew Tates, your pickup artists, all those type of Manosphere influencers. The blue pill, as I described, indicates normies. So men and women who haven't heard anything about this, they're just going about their lives, blissfully unaware of the real way that the mating market works. And then, like I say, incels take the black pill, which is a particularly bleak truth that they believe, no, actually the real nature of the mating market is that some men never stood a chance at all. It's all based on looks. People are lying to you about it all, and you should just give up.
Well, I guess encapsulating all of this is this very nebulous concept of the manosphere, within which there are many groups. We talked about Andrew Tate, who's sort of a pickup artist, but then there's also incels. And then there's the MGTOWs, which stands for men going their own way. And then there's the men's rights activists. Those are the men that are just trying to change laws and sort of government policy and just raise awareness around issues that I often talk about. Often they don't like each other. Men's rights activists, if you go on men's rights, they absolutely hate Andrew Tate. They hate him. They despise him because he ruins their credibility. Incels hate Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate hates incels. MGTOWs are very different. They're sort of about leaving women behind, whereas incels are involuntary.
Yes, Jordan Peterson is often thrown into the mix.
Check him in there.
Jordan Peterson, his message to incels is so. I mean, it's not. It could never be described as pro-incel. And Jordan Peterson's message to incels is, young man, if every woman in the world doesn't want you, they're right, you're wrong. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps, bucko. That's literally vintage Jordan Peterson message, self-development that incels hate. So the fact that I always hear Jordan Peterson and incels and Andrew Tate all thrown in together, it drives me crazy sometimes. He helped me in 2016. I really turned my life around from having discovered Jordan Peterson and believing in my own potential and taking myself seriously, making each next day better than the day before. Simple maxims that people maybe sneer at as traditional wisdom. Well, it appears to be traditional wisdom that young men have not had access to. And he's able to speak in a way that really appeals to young men. So I think we should try and capitalize on that rather than make him emblematic of the problem. Yeah. Now, perhaps some of his religious stuff and political stuff recently, I'm less so keen on, but I think he's at his strongest when you talk about development and cultivation of relationships. But on Piers Morgan, it was a very powerful interview Jordan Peterson gave. Piers Morgan kind of sneeringly said, are you the king of the incels? Are you this loser group of men who, hang around in their mother's basements, and kind of really denigrated them? And Jordan Peterson got quite emotional and tearful, which he's prone to do. He said, sure, aren't the marginalized supposed to have a voice? Aren't young men who don't know how to make themselves attractive to women? Why not? I'll stand up for them.
I've seen that interview too, but unfortunately, being that character for incels, it ranks very highly on the integrity for me, but it ranks very low on the social credibility. You're not going to get much social credit for that. And I feel like Jordan has left behind a discussion of men and boys because he got so much hate, and we're all worse off as a result. Well, I would love to know, obviously, there's going to be a lot of people now sitting down their sons on the ends of their beds. What would you say to a hypothetical son of yours if you were in that position? Or what would you advise parents to say to their sons in what is undoubtedly happening in bedrooms all over the world right now?
So one thing that's very important in terms of any intervention on extremist radicalization pathways is the idea of being a credible role model. So that's very difficult for a parent or a teacher even to do, because they're naturally put into the box of fuddy-duddy adult who doesn't know. But if you're someone who your son has been captured by this red pill ideology, the incel one is a little bit different, but let's talk about the red pill manosphere, pickup artisty type stuff first. I would really bang the drum about this developmental arc that the people who've succeeded in that game. So the type of guy like Neil Strauss, the type of guy like Tucker Max, even Dan Bilzerian, the type of guys who got to the top of the mountain in terms of what the red pill is offering and figured out, you know what, it's fulfilling at all. And they try to then figure out, how do I cultivate a good long-term relationship and trust with a woman and a fulfilling relationship? I would champion those stories, tell them in schools, and prioritize training young men and young women how to cultivate positive long-term relationships. There's a lack of training for that. But yeah, given that parents and teachers are never going to be seen as the cool, credible role model, I think you have to kind of reach them where they are. And if those are the type of people who have had influence with them, it's hard to describe people who've succeeded in that game, in that red pill game, as not credible. right? So you have to really show the emptiness of what they're offering. With incel problem, it's a little bit more difficult because it's a different problem to have a young man who's given up on it. My opinion is that people shouldn't give up. And yes, to be romantically successful, you have to go through a lot of anxiety, go through a lot of rejection. Everyone knows this. But I'm of the opinion that what's on the other side is worth it. But that's very easy for me to say. It's never been extraordinarily difficult where I've felt I can't develop relationships. Relationships that come with their own other difficulties for sure. But it's easy for me to say, oh yeah, just keep trying, go get rejected 100 more times and it'll be worth it when you get there in the end. That's a very tall order to ask a young man to do. So I think if we can cultivate tools to help them to do that, that would be really important. But also just to intervene at the level of these incels, these young men, they're lacking friendships and interests more broadly. And the show tried to get at that by saying the parents talked about how, well, he tried different hobbies, he never succeeded in them. He was always on his computer. That is the troubling worry. And they're learning about the world through online influencers rather than real world interactions.
I would just echo what you said with words, advice from my mum, who's neither a man nor online, and she's always said everything in moderation. Of course, she said that around diet because she is a nutritionist, but the same is true for social media.
Yeah, my mother said the exact same thing.
You got to take a little bit of everything, and I feel like the more we silo people off and push people down a one route track, the more we deprive them of that.
Another thing that incels could do is you can cultivate loads of different niche status hierarchies. So that's one thing humans can do pretty uniquely. You don't have to be the best guy in the gym. You don't have to be the best athlete. You can be the smartest. You can be the most artistic. You can be the most musical. There's lots of different status hierarchies you can ascend. And what the problem is, in school, there's only one, and you're trapped in it, and you can't get out of it. So it's torture for young boys and girls. But as you proceed in life, you're able to be more intentional about cultivating the status hierarchies you navigate and how you do that. And you can game the game of life in more in your favor, or at least more intentionally, if you can. Cultivating autonomy is difficult, but it's important.
One of the things you mentioned earlier as well was about getting boys offline and meeting role models in the real world. It reminds me a little bit about, you've probably seen a clip in Westminster again just today saying, we should start showing Adolescence in Westminster. I think you should, only if it's going to cause conversations like this. But it frustrated me because obviously in the UK, we've been closing down youth clubs and sports centres and libraries and Boy Scouts and stuff like that, like nobody's business. And I'm like, well, don't open them back up. Give boys a place to go. Give boys and girls a place to go, but in this instance, boys. Open up those leisure clubs. Open up those boxing societies. Don't just watch Netflix show and expect that to solve anything.
I totally agree. But one thing that's challenging on that is, yes, we should all spend more time doing our hobbies, getting outside, touching grass, etc. But everyone is an internet addict, right? So it's really difficult to intervene at that level. So it's also important just to cultivate the online presence. You're not going to get rid. Like, I've seen some suggestions that we should just take away the phones. I don't think it's realistic. I think, yes, try and cultivate a better online diet of content. That's more important and realistic than ban the phones. I don't think bans typically work anyway. But
He didn't even use his phone, Jamie. Even in the show, he looked at it on his computer. So what, are you going to ban that as well? Or ban, it's not about banning anything. It's about trying to open that closed door.
Agreed.
Which opens from the inside, and understanding what's actually going on inside the bedroom. I suppose that's a lovely way to start wrapping up. But I would just love to, hopefully, the future, this goes in the right way, as we discussed. My good friend Ali Fogg described it as a Reefer Madness for online misogyny. I don't know if you know Reefer Madness, but it's like a propaganda film from the 1930s where it's all about weed. And it was like, there were some young men and women having a great time until weed came along.
Yeah, there is a danger that this becomes misdirected. It's very important that the conversation going forward is informed by the research and that the research continues to grow, because it's still very early days in understanding this problem. So research is vital. The next step for us as a research team is to try and get some funding for some longitudinal research, which there's a massive gap for. So perhaps maybe the extra attention on the topic that this show has garnered will also bring with it some motivation from governments, from different groups to fund some more research into it specifically. I found that our initial research has been enormously valuable. Those two findings alone about the autism and the suicidality open up complete avenues for future research. In my mind, very rare to get such stark findings in any psychology study.
Agreed, totally agreed. And I mean, the first word of whatever story comes next has to be one of compassion.
There is a tendency, I think, of fear. Another fear I have, just while I think about it, is that there's a certain type of the online world or of the culture at the moment that will be so peeved by the fact that they cast a 13-year-old white boy instead of the prototypical face of knife violence. I would encourage people to try and move past that and, don't fixate on that. Don't hunker down into that. Yes, It is not very representative, and there is a bigger issue of, well, what's the larger problem in terms of the numbers of the statistics. But for this problem specifically, let's try and use the goodwill towards the topic that the show has garnered and capitalize on the good.
Well, it's a bit like the advice we gave about Jordan Peterson. It's like, love it or hate it, people are listening and people want to talk about it. And like, whether you or I love that, people are willing to talk about the show. So let's go where people have voted with their feet. That's how it's going to go. Let's start there and push it in a conversation in a way that is compassionate and understanding and honest and inclusive and obviously evidence-based. You talked a lot about you hope the future is based on research. So maybe we can end off by asking you, where is the research? How do we find your research? How do we read your research? And how do we contact you if needed?
So the good news is we just had a paper accepted yesterday for publication in the Archives of Sexual Behaviour. So if you follow me on X or on Blue Sky at Costello William, you'll find me, and I'm always posting about what we do. Also, my Google Scholar account, if you go to William Costello, you'll see all our published work on a number of different publications on this topic, and we'll continue to publish more. We also did the government report, which was published in February 2024 for the Commission for Countering Extremism. You can find that online, along with our a video on YouTube of our presentation of our findings to the Women and Equalities Committee at UK Parliament. I'd encourage you to watch that as well. Hopefully they maybe get us back again to talk more, maybe about in the context of the show. That would be great. But mainly if you follow me online, there's also a ton more William Costello YouTube interviews out there. There's no shortage of them, so you can go fill your boots on this topic.
I'd love to thank you on that note, William. It's been enlightening as always, and a pleasure and an honour. And thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone's really enjoyed it. I'm sure they have.
Yeah. And thank you, George, for all you do in the world. You're fighting a difficult battle at times, but I think you do it with great skill, and you're a great force for good in the world because of it.
Well, stop it. Thank you very much, William. And we'll talk again soon. Bye.
Very good. Thank you.